Okay, I think we're going to begin the evening. Actually, maybe the best way to do this is to say that the sooner I've stopped talking, the sooner you can receive your meal. So, as we discussed earlier this evening, we are, of course, in France, so I would like to say a few words in French. Bonsoir, bonsoir à tous. Je vous remercie tous d'être encore parmi nous. C'est un grand plaisir de vous recevoir tous à cet événement pour l'Université américaine de Paris. So good evening, and I'd like to begin by thanking everybody once again for their participation in these events. In particular, I guess I'm standing up, but Albert, could you just stand up for 1 minute and we could give a round of applause? But Albert and I would both like to thank our keynote speakers, the quality of both the speeches by the keynote speakers as well as the papers has just more than met our expectations, and we're just very thankful for that. We are also very thankful to Celeste, who has made this event possible in so many ways, and for those of you who are here for the inauguration, are witnessing her vision for the university. And thank you to Bill. Where is Bill? Bill is in the back. Our new and fearless provost, who is leading us forward on this new adventure, on our new paquebot, right? I would also like to thank Ambassador Burns for everything that he has sort of in the process of these series of conversations we've had. It has been tremendously exciting to watch this unfold, and we're looking very forward to the event at Harvard. And Ray, where is Ray? Why am I not seeing Ray? Because he's right in front of me, of course. This is thank you, Ray. This is you have. It's just been a great pleasure to work with you on this project and to just see everything that you're. Well, to be honest, the enthusiasm about a historical topic. You know, when you're a historian, and I'm sure Albert could attest to this. You know, sometimes you feel a little bit alone, and you think, oh, I wish I had decided to do political science or something that people actually cared about. And then somebody like Ray shows up and says, you know, these ideas for a conference that is deeply dedicated to it, and obviously without that, it just wouldn't have happened. And then, of course, Ambassador Stapleton, who we have learned generated this idea through the reading of Margaret Macmillan's book, and when you have that kind of wind to your back, apparently there's nothing you can't accomplish. So thank you very much. So as you've seen, this event has been dedicated to the history of the treaty, to its multiple facets, and perhaps above all, to pushing towards a new understanding of this global event in a new global moment. As I said yesterday, this event has always been global, and Margaret Macmillan spoke about that this evening. But at some level, there's you're reminded we're in Paris, this great home of the 19th century, and it feels to some extent, we're looking at this as if it were a Cubist painting or like the modernist literature that was thriving at approximately the same time that the treaty was taking place, and just trying to get your head around this event that seems to be constantly cut off, pathways that are opened and then stopped, new perspectives that open up, and then trying to see and to get a sense of the whole. And we've been trying to do that since the beginning, and the papers have really just sort of added one more layer to this kind of an understanding. Fortunately, this is only a beginning. As Ambassador Nicholas Burns explained in his opening remarks yesterday morning, it was just yesterday morning, there will be a second conference at the Belfer Center of the Kennedy School, which will be building on these historical perspectives to look sort of perhaps looking backwards to look forwards at some level. So tonight we will be enjoying yet another wonderful meal. We will hear from Celeste, our President Celeste Schenck, Ambassador Burns, and the chair of AUP's board, Ray. And I'd like to just take this moment to thank all of you once again for coming and for your support for this event. So thank you very much.
I have a very special person to introduce you to, but I'm going to take, when you have the mic, you use it, and there is one thing I'd like to say. I want to say how proud I am tonight at this remarkable gathering that we have had together over the last 2 days. AUP aims to be the kind of university that has its doors open to everyone. And what I have loved is that the Academy, instead of doing what we usually do, which is to speak amongst ourselves, has kind of opened its doors and windows to the most wonderful mixed group of people. And we have had members of the military, politicians, diplomats, board members, faculty, staff, and students, friends, journalists, and we have had also amongst our conference speakers not only the doyen and the doyenne of World War I studies, Professor Soutou and Madame Macmillan, but we have also had, and I'm very proud of this was a very important thing for Steve and Albert both, which was to invite young scholars, and some of our scholars were doctoral students, and they were holding their own beautifully alongside. I also love the fact, and I hope all of you felt, that you could say anything you wanted to say. That's one of the things we aim to do in this country that is decidedly not politically correct, and where we invite students actually with different attitudes and different ideas to share with one another. So I've also loved the fact that we have reconstructed and deconstructed 1919 3 or 4 times over the course of the last few days, and thanks to you, Margaret, we reconstructed at the end. So we'll all leave with a coherent narrative. We'll leave with a coherent narrative of 1919. So we hope this is the first time we have ever done anything like this, and we are, of course, planning to do it again. And I hope you'll come back, and we'll offer another conference in a different context, probably 2 years from now, when we open our new Montessori Center for the Arts. We may do a whole week on global modernisms, and you will all be invited back to have an intense course in the multiplicity of nationalities and people who came through Paris between 1930 and 1950 to make art. So now I'm going to introduce a very special person, Ambassador Nicholas Burns. What an incredible honor tonight to hear your remarks pointing forward to our next conference next year, the Centennial Conference that'll be held at the Kennedy School. I think no one could be better placed to launch reflection on the impact of the Paris Peace Conference on a century of public policy, this because of your 30-year career in public service to the country of your birth, the United States, but also through your ambassadorial and diplomatic work and many thoughtfully and responsibly negotiated settlements to the world. You're a veteran of the U.S. Foreign Service who not only served as ambassador to NATO and to Greece, but also to three administrations on both sides of the political spectrum. You were a member of the National Security Council under Clinton, Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs during the Bush administration, and a member of John Kerry's Foreign Affairs Policy Board under Obama. You have received 12 honorary degrees and the Presidential Distinguished Service Award and many, many, many others. As the founder of the Future of Diplomacy Project, though, and this is perhaps the most important thing you do, you teach young people to believe in the power of diplomacy to avert war, to think globally, to sit in the chair of another, to practice the critical art of negotiation in which both sides win. That, folks, is truly the true art of the deal. Both sides win. 2 years ago this week, you joined us in Paris to receive an honorary degree from AUP and to give our commencement speech. You did not mince words on that evening, reminding our students of their exceptional positioning between and amongst cultures, exhorting them to live lives of public service, and calling out the series of threats that face our and their generation: the return of the far right across the world, the rise of authoritarian governments, the dangerous shifting of alliances, the decline of public debate and of diplomacy. At the end of that commencement speech, you received something I have never seen, and believe me, I'm a veteran of commencement ceremonies. At the end, you received a long and thunderous standing ovation. As a public servant, a specialist in foreign relations and national security, a statesman, an author, and an educator, you are foremost a principled citizen of the world. Ambassador Burns. It's such a joy to be with you on this conference.
Thank you. Celeste, thank you so much. You are too kind. I'm going to say a nice word about you at the end, which you fully deserve. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I've interrupted your dinner. I apologize for that. Many of you know the old saying, by this point in the proceedings of this extraordinary conference, everything that could possibly be said has already been said, but just not by everybody. And I am, unfortunately for all of you, I am that somebody. We've learned, the brilliant lecture that Margaret gave, we've learned that in the first 6 months of 1919, all roads led to Paris. I want to say a few words about that, but not a big speech, because we've had a lot of speeches. A few words about that, a story, some reflections, but a personal reflection first. In many ways, all roads have led to Paris for our family, because Libby and I met 43 years ago. We were very young. In the 14th arrondissement, here in Paris. We spent a year here studying. It was a great year. We spent our honeymoon here. We've been here multiple times every decade since the 1970s. And it was our oldest daughter, Sarah, who chose AUP in 2001. She graduated in 2005. She brought us here to this institution, Celeste and Ray, a long time ago. And just as Libby and I met here in the City of Light and the City of Love, Sarah met her future husband, Brian Corbin, right here in Paris. So we have two other daughters, Caroline and Elizabeth. And as far as we know, they've not yet met the loves of their life. So I think you know where I'm going with this. We're going to send them to Paris. It was Libby's great uncle, the American writer Hervey Allen of the 1920s and 30s and 40s, however, who gave us and gave posterity an insightful look into what happened to the United States when Woodrow Wilson stood before Congress April 2nd, 1917, and he said, "The right is more precious than peace." And the United States had to enter a European war for the first time in American history. He was a young graduate of the University of Pittsburgh, and he and his brother Wynn in 1917 signed up for the United States Army. A year later, he found himself in the summer of 1918 as lieutenant, leading his very green American troops into the savagery of the Second Battle of the Marne that you referred to in July-August of 1918. The French and Americans, Monsieur le Président, had linked arms to drive the Germans back from the positions the Germans had held for 4 years since the summer of 1914. And Libby and I had read Hervey Allen's remarkable 1926 war memoir, Toward the Flame. It's a riveting account, a very sophisticated account of what it was like to be an infantry officer marching towards the flames of the Great War. And so last June, Libby and I spent a couple of days following in his footsteps. How many Americans of our generation recall the fact that the United States had 4.7 million men and women in uniform in the First World War in 1917 and 1918? That 2 million of them were here in this one country in France, and that by July, August 1918, 375,000 American combat soldiers were on the front lines, on the Marne River, under French command, fighting against the Germans in often vicious hand-to-hand fighting. And the Germans were a tough, skilled, veteran army by 1918. And so we followed by car the long march, actually 60, 70 miles, that these American troops made that summer to the Marne. And we drove through the impossibly beautiful vineyards and countryside of Champagne and the Aisne-Marne region, and it was instructive. And it was really inspiring to see what the French and the Americans accomplished together that summer. You'll recognize some of the iconic names from his book, the towns he walked through that we drove through. Belleau Wood, which is really, if you know a little bit about the United States Marines, and General Nicholson's a compatriot of the Marines as an Army officer, it's a sacred spot for the United States Marines. We went to the French and American cemetery at Château-Thierry that pays tribute to the thousands of French and American soldiers. There's a beautiful statue representing the two countries standing side by side, guarding the graves of tens of thousands of soldiers who died together. We went to a church on a lonely crossroads in Belleau, the little village outside the cemetery. This church was destroyed during the Marne offensive and then was rebuilt by the U.S. 27th Division in the 1920s because they felt they owed something to the villagers who had shielded them and been their supporters during the offensive. Another church in the little village of APA, where Allen and his men found a dead German soldier, and then just a couple of hundred meters up the road, live German soldiers, as they entered combat for the first time. They crossed the Marne. The Germans had retreated actually north of the Marne to the Vesle River, where they were protecting their retreat after August 8th, 1918. And Allen's climactic moment as a soldier in the war was leading his men into a nighttime battle on the Vesle River in the town of Fismes, and the majority of his men died in that battle that night, fighting Germans and fighting the Flammenwerfers, the German flamethrowers that he writes terrified the American soldiers in night action. He was wounded, he was gassed, he barely survived. He ended up in a field hospital, and he spent weeks writing this account of the long march from Château-Thierry, from Belleau Wood to the Vesle River, and on under the command of his French compatriots. It was very stirring, to say the least, last summer at dusk when we arrived in the town of Fismes to see two beautiful, tall, bronze columns flanking the bridge where he had fought. And of course, that was put up by the state of Pennsylvania. He was from Pennsylvania, to the 28th Division, because they took significant casualties in that vicious battle of the Marne. The French town of Fismes also created for its centennial last year, centennial of the war, a memorial to the Americans who came to fight for them, including a beautiful memorial to Libby's great uncle. He was just one of 2 million Americans who fought in this country a century ago. And the sacrifices made by the French and by the Americans together have been memorialized, as Debbie and Craig know, because they represented us here with such dignity and grace, by the American Battle Monuments Commission throughout northern France and along the Marne River. And if you live here, if you're French and you've been out there, if you're American, it's extraordinary to see in every French village a monument to their soldiers, and that we have taken such great care with the cemeteries and the monuments to memorialize our soldiers as well. And it represents this remarkable friendship and alliance between the Americans and the French. It goes all the way back to October 1781. We wouldn't have won at Yorktown without the French fleet. It goes before that, when the French intervened on our side in the Revolutionary War. 2 of Libby's ancestors fought with the French in those battles. We had an alliance in 1917 and 1918. The Americans forgot about that alliance in the 1920s and 30s. It didn't really exist. We didn't work together. We reformed it on April 4th, 1949, when NATO was created. And even to this day, I can say as a former American ambassador, we've had our arguments with the French. I had many with my French colleague Benoit d'Abbeville in February, March of 2003. But we've had so many moments of solidarity and of alliance. Right now, tonight, there are 3,000 French soldiers in Mali fighting in the northern desert against Malian terrorists, supported by American air power and American intelligence. So we've relearned, I think, Celeste, Ray, over the last 2 days at this conference, that the United States has a friend here in France, has an ally, and that we have to make sure that we are always true, we Americans, to that alliance. Truman and Eisenhower, of course, knew war. Truman had fought in the First World War. Marshall had fought, of course, in the First World War and had run the Second World War. As you said tonight, it wasn't immediate, but by 1947 and 1948 and 1949, we had concluded that we had to reform this alliance with the West Europeans and certainly with the French. I saw firsthand the value of this alliance as a very new American ambassador to NATO on September 11th, 2001. We were hit hard in New York and Washington, D.C. We were cut off from the State Department and the White House and Pentagon because they were all evacuated that terrible morning. And in the afternoon, I got a call from my Canadian colleague, David Wright. He was the dean of our diplomatic corps, and he said, have you thought about invoking Article 5? Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, that's the core of the NATO Treaty. An attack on one of us shall be considered an attack on all of us. And we operate by consensus in NATO. Every country has to agree before we do anything. And I was just concerned that if one or two of the allies held out, the story the next day for the American people would be NATO fails to defend the United States. But when I called Benoit d'Abbeville, my French colleague, he didn't flinch. He said, I'll have to call Paris. I'll have to get instructions, but I have no doubt how my government is going to react. And Article 5 had never been invoked in the history of the alliance. Every American president, I think, had assumed from Truman on that if it ever were to be invoked, it would be because there had been an attack here in Europe, probably by the Soviet Union in the 50s or 60s or 70s, and the Americans would come a third time across the pond to fight with the Europeans. And so one of the great ironies of 9/11 is that it was the United States that was rescued that day by our NATO allies. And by early in the morning of September 11th, all of the NATO allies at that time, 18 of them led by Canada and by France and by the United Kingdom, had come to our defense. And I had to call somebody in Washington to get instructions because we were invoking Article 5 to go to war and to fight against Al-Qaeda. I called Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, at 4 a.m. Washington time. I said, Condi, the allies are with us. They want to go to war with us. She said, go for it. I said, but I needed a presidential instruction to make this vote. She said, go for it. And I began to object a third time that I needed to get the president on the phone. She said, Nick, the president's had a really bad day. He's trying to get some sleep. And she said, go for it. And I said, I'm going to go down to room 1. We're going to take the vote, and we're going to make this pledge. She said, one more thing. She said, isn't it good to have friends in the world? Isn't it good when the chips are down, she said, to have friends in the world? And I've recalled her words. And that moment, more than a few times during the past 2 years, when we have distanced ourselves so unwisely from those very same allies. It's instructive to remember the European Union is our largest trade partner. The European Union is the largest investor into the American economy. The NATO allies, by far, now 28 of them, represent the greatest number of American treaty allies in the world. We really depend on Europe. And this alliance, as well as our East Asian treaty allies, they're the great power differential between the United States and China and the United States and Russia, who have no allies If they had a 9/11, no one's going to sign up to fight for Moscow or Beijing, but they did sign up to fight with us and for us, and as the general knows, and he commended the NATO troops, every single one of those NATO allies went into Afghanistan with us. Every single one. And a lot of the partner nations, the general had 41 nations, I believe, under your command. Every American president of both political parties, from Truman on, Eisenhower, Republican and Democrat, knew that we had to believe in NATO, knew that the European Union, by ending the Franco-German rivalry, 1871, 1914, 1939, that had to be in the interest of the United States. We've championed every phase of the development of the European Union, from the coal and steel community of the 1940s, to the Treaty of Rome in 1957, to the common market of the 60s and 70s, to Maastricht, to the single currency, to Schengen. And that is why it is such a colossal, historic mistake for President Trump to now describe our policy toward the European Union, as we discussed yesterday. I think Philip and I both mentioned it. He says they're competitors. We're opposed to them. We don't believe in what they're doing. And he's wrong as well to denigrate NATO, to cast doubt openly, as he has done, on whether he'd redeem the Article 5 commitment if one of our allies were attacked, say one of our smaller East European allies, like Montenegro, by the Russian Federation. He has turned 70 years of careful, wise, effective, bipartisan American policy toward Europe on its head. In a time when his own government is drawing inward, seeking to build walls, raise drawbridges over the modern moats it has dug around our country, it is important to remember as Americans that we live in a cruel, often dangerous world, and that we need our allies, just as they need us. How else, if you think about the mission of our students here at AUP, these young people are going to graduate on Monday, how else can they be successful in arresting climate change, in stabilizing the global economy, and taking on the crime and drug cartels, in dealing with Putin's cyber aggression, the nuclear dreams of Iran and North Korea? How else can we be successful in the world today if we choose to live on an island, if we forget who our true friends and allies are? We're fighting a battle of ideas. The Russians and Chinese are convinced, they're brimming with self-confidence, that their authoritarian model is the way forward. Where are our JFKs and Reagans? Where is our Thatcher? Where is our Charles de Gaulle? We're fighting a battle of technology for dominance in AI and quantum computing and biotechnology. Our closest scientific, technological, military, political, democratic allies are here. And they're in East Asia, in Japan and South Korea and Australia and New Zealand, in India. Those are our allies. They are the friends that we can count on. And I think this conference, and all these wonderful historians who've spoken, Stephen, thank you for gathering them all here. I think it's reminding us of how important it is that the Europeans and Americans and Canadians relearn together the mistakes of judgment, the hubris, and even the folly that marked the Versailles Conference, and the actions and inactions of the Americans and others in the interwar period. Margaret, you wrote in an article I read of yours recently, this is a somber warning, you said, a somber warning to all of us 100 years later, that we have to remember what makes us effective in the world. So we have a sea of challenges ahead of us. But we also have hope. We always have hope. I gave a speech at Harvard a couple of years ago, and they said, assess the global trend lines, and I just talked about all the dangers. And I was walking home with Libby in Cambridge, and I said, how did that go? And there was a pause. And she said, you're depressing everybody. And I said, what do you mean? She said, I get that there are challenges in the world today, but surely, analytically, there's some positive global trend lines. And there are. And so I think for our students at AUP and Harvard and all the other universities represented here, mean, they can battle poverty. 1 billion people lifted out of poverty the last 30 years. Bill Gates thinks that that generation can eradicate certainly polio in the next 5 years, maybe malaria in the next 25 years. That they're living in an age where women are rising to positions of prominence and authority all over the Western world, maybe in the future all over the world, and they see the positive side of technology. Maybe the older people see the double-edged sword, but the young people see the promise. So there's hope. And I think, and I'll conclude with this, we have to hope that the United States and United Kingdom, the victorious, two of them, powers at Versailles, and until very recently, I think the most dynamic of the global democracies, we have to hope that the United States and United Kingdom will revive themselves and recover from the twin existential crises that we're both experiencing. We have to hope that the American people in particular can resist the temptation of retreat, again, from global leadership as we did so unwisely after 1919. And I know we have to hope in diplomacy. We have a gentleman here, Jim Lowenstein, who, if you remember that beautiful room we were in last night, he worked in that room, you don't mind me saying this, in 1950 as a 22-year-old American diplomat. We have Chris Hill, American Foreign Service Officer. We have Phil Zelikow, American Foreign Service Officer. We have Craig and Debbie, American ambassadors in the Czech Republic and in France. We have Libby, who was with me throughout my entire diplomatic career, rather than resort reflexively to force. And I think General Nicholson spoke eloquently today about this. We might want to start with diplomacy. We might want to think that we can outwit our rivals, that we can build coalitions, and that diplomacy imposes a restraint on both sides and gives us a pause and time to cool the temperatures and figure out a way without killing 16 or 17 million, whatever the total was at the end of the Great War. And frankly, we should have hope in this millennial generation. We have 3 millennial daughters. You've got 2 millennial kids. Celeste has 2 millennial kids. You know, they take a lot of criticism on the late night talk shows and Saturday Night Live. This is a bright, optimistic, energetic, caring generation. And when they walk across the stage at the beautiful theater here in Paris after your speech on Monday, you're going to see that energy and that idealism in the students here at the American University of Paris, and we're going to see it on Thursday at Harvard when our students take that walk as well. I'm hopeful. We're going to survive these crises. Our institutions are strong, and our young people are going to demand that we do that. So here's my pledge. We're going to invite you all to Harvard, second half of April 2020. Ray and Celeste and I and Libby are going to work on this. We're going to convene to talk, and Margaret's already agreed to come, so she is committed right now. You're committed. Here's our charge. And Philip and Chris and General Nicholson and I talked about a little bit today. What's the impact of 1919 on us, 2019, 2020? On the Balkans, on the fractured relationship between Russia and the West, on the violence of the Middle East, on the problems in the U.S.-China relationship, the Ottoman-inspired dreams of the Turks. How do we deal with that? This legacy of the collapse of empire and Versailles 1919. You're all invited to Harvard. Let me just say thank you to the incredible staff here at AUP. What a wonderful organization. If those of you, maybe you can stand up. If your staff members... And Stephen and Albert, please. Yes. Thank you. Madame la Présidente, Celeste and Ray, thank you. And finally, can we call him le parrain, our godfather? Craig, thank you for inspiring us. Thank you very much.
Well, we have an array of activities tomorrow, but this is the last evening we will all be together, so I'll just be very brief, but it's been a wonderful several days. I remember just a couple of hours ago, Margaret making the comment that you can just slip into war by accident. We talked about it, General Nicholson in the panel. So it was wonderful, Nick, to hear your reflections on Libby's uncle in the Marne, which was terrific. We need to be reminded about that, and to hear Lord Astor's comments about his great uncle and his grandfather in the war as well. I think it's important, but thankfully, Nick, you ended up with hope and with that wonderful comment that I don't think any of us are ever going to forget. It's a good life story in addition to a diplomatic story from Condoleezza Rice about isn't it good to have some friends in the world. I think if we all leave here remembering that line, you'll have left us with something that's just wonderful. But let me say one more thing about Nick. One could not ask for a better partner than Nick Burns. Nick has this enthusiastic spirit, as you've seen this entire weekend. He's always got a smile, and he's always got a can-do. He's always asking, how can I help? What else can I do? And you've just set the tone for our entire planning and our work. Every time some little thing went wrong, I'd say, let's have a conference call with Nick, because I know he's going to make us all feel good, Craig, and that's exactly what's happened. Celeste, right? Every time we get on the phone with Nick, our energy gets back again, and we're all set. So, Nick, thanks for that. You've just truly been a remarkable partner, and thank you for the invitation to Cambridge. Thank you. So on behalf of my fellow conference founding committee members, Craig and Debbie, sitting here, and Al and Kathy, who are sitting there, and Elizabeth and Paul sitting there, I want to add my thanks and commendation to Celeste for our scholars here tonight. For your research first, but I think as we saw importantly, and I think it's just as important, your success in telling stories in such compelling ways. It's really important, and we've all enjoyed it so much. And I want to add my thanks to our two really star co-chairs of this, Steve and Albert, and thank you again. And as Celeste said, their idea right from the outset is we're going to try to attract the true stars, the true star historians, the most important authors and scholars, and that's going to be the first part of what we do. And they certainly did that, as we've heard over the last several days, with Professors Hahn and Satie and Tooze and Sellico and Soutou and Chatriot, and of course ending up this evening with Margaret McMillan. But I think importantly, right from the outset, Steve and Albert said, we want to showcase young, emerging scholars. And if you heard the young scholars that we had over the last few days, I think it adds to our hope, Nick, about the future and the future of higher education and the future of history and diplomacy. And it's been just showcased there. So thank you very much to our young scholars as well. And another special idea and feature of this, which was really Craig's vision for it and then Nick's vision, is that at a historical conference, we would also have diplomats and public policy leaders who'd help us really appreciate and understand the lessons of what happens when history breaks down and the ways in which diplomacy can help us avoid conflict. And so I want to thank Lord Astor and Ambassador Burns and Hill and Ambassador Meyer-Landrut, who was so good the other day at lunch, and General Nicholson and Philip Zelikow, who wore two hats as historian and then all his experience in the national security and in foreign policy. And of course, thank my other partner in this, Celeste. Thank you for your leadership and your enthusiasm. And then to all our guests, thank you for your participation and your support. We appreciated that the academics invited us into their conference, but I think our guests really added so much to it, and we thank you for being here. It's been terrific to welcome you to Paris and to the American University of Paris. And just one more thanks to the visionary and founder of this, Craig, and his partner really in all of this, Debbie, for sure, the two of them. What a treat it's been to work with the two of them, and you saw what happens when you get the two of them together when we had dinner last night at Talleyrand. It was just so special. And I also want to thank one other friend who is really kind of the co-pair of all of this, an AUP parent, Peter Kastenfeld, who's very much been involved in this right from the outset, Craig, along with us. Nick, you very kindly thanked the members of our AUP staff who've been here to help people and of course did all the planning work, and thank you very much for that. I wanted to add two more people who aren't official parts of the AUP team, but we drafted them, thankfully, a number of months ago, and you've all seen them everywhere, and I'm going to ask them to come out here if they wouldn't mind, Elise Lyons and Donna Burns. And all I can say at this point is I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. I hope you have safe flights home. I hope you enjoy tomorrow's activities. And keep in mind that we have other conferences. We have interesting speakers coming, and we'd love to see any of you from out of town who come through Paris. We'd love to have you come to the American University of Paris. Let Mary know. Let Celeste know. Let us know when you're coming. We'd love to welcome you. Thank you.